And he rubs his nose because what he knows, you are going to want to know. History repeats, and surprisingly, we're living in uncharted times, so it seems. So, how do you put those two things together? Well, there's only one way to do it, and that is to study the news of the day. And how do you do that when you don't get access to it and the media won't report? Well, you have to do it yourself. And that's what we do here at World Series News. We dig very deep and we link up with people from all around the world with similar interests. And as you know, if you've been following this program for the last couple of months, you've met Simon from Florida, who is one of the best news hounds that you will ever find. One of the great geopolitical experts, in fact, in the citizen journalist world. You don't get that anymore out there because it's just unreliable, so you have to do it all yourself. Simon's work has taken him onto the George Galloway show, onto InfoWars, and is a regular contributor on those platforms and others, and will be on the radio this weekend as well. If you can check out, we might check in and see what's happening there. But the purpose of this show, different from the one we just put out about Pakistan, is that this Friday, three massive meetings are taking place around the world: G7, the C5, and the Arab League. Now, you have different groups of countries putting together different deals in a world that is somehow determined to reinvent itself. You have the Great Eurasian Partnership led by China and Russia and the BRICS nations, and you have the West, those that feature in the G7, including France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Canada, UK, and the US, meeting. And they have a very different stance. One is on the Russian side of the fence, and the other on the Ukrainian side of the fence. And then you have the Arab League, intent on reintroducing Syria into the mix. And this comes with a different set of rules and conditions that the Arabs have already determined, but which the German counterparts are sticking their head where it's not wanted and offending this particular group. So, to explain it all and what it means and how these triggers that set off the Gulf War may indeed be repeating themselves, there's only one way to find out: those that dig very deep. Simon is the biggest digger of them all, and he's back here to get into it. Simon, all sounds a bit confusing, but we need to keep it light because the news of the day is really, really serious, and the people need to understand that this could in fact be a pathway that ignites World War III one way or another. It's frightening, but we need to get into the news.
Well, hi there, Jason. I was always under the impression that to be called a digger was the greatest of compliments.
Well, it is. Certainly is here in Australia, so thank you.
Well,
now
I'll let you decide where we lead off. People just need to understand, though your introduction was exemplary, that it's quite unusual in international affairs for 3 or 4 large meetings to occur simultaneously. And that's what we have occurring on Friday this week, and you're already on Thursday, right? So, the meetings in Japan are going to be Friday your time, and then we kind of go back across the time zones. But as we will explain, the people who are hearing this broadcast are getting everything put not only all together, but in context. And this is why we are somewhat unique. Because, we're not literally just reading off a teleprompter and simply stating that X meeting or Y meeting is occurring on this day. It's why is it relevant? Who are the participants? How has it come about? What does that forecast for the future? And what both intended and unintended consequences may that generate? So people will have to pay quite a bit of attention to this broadcast because we've got a lot to run through in the next 60 minutes, okay?
Yeah, well said. Now, I think it's probably important for many people won't understand what the C5 is. And I'm going to put a picture on the screen now because something truly unprecedented occurred, and it's the ceremony that goes along with all of these meetings. Now, for most of us, we just hear the aftermath. A new deal was signed. Generally, it's just a free trade agreement and nothing much changes in the average person's life. But when you have a restructuring of the world and the arrangements that are going on and the fanfare that goes along with it, ceremony is a very big deal, particularly as it is with China, who is now truly the world's superpower. But these pictures were truly remarkable. I'm going to put them up on screen now, coming out of the meeting with Kazakhstan, where the president arrived for a meeting in China. This is not nothing. It was massive, wasn't it? The show they put on.
Yeah, so this wasn't the meeting. This was just the guy getting out of his plane. And so it's maybe not clear. Maybe in post-production we'll have the opportunity to add the full 2-minute video. Rather than just having a squad of honor guard, he had like a double rank honor guard, extremely smartly turned out. The red carpet, and I'm really not exaggerating, was like 300 or 400 meters long. He was welcomed by officials, given a bouquet of flowers by some cute little girl, and then after it inspected the exceptionally well turned out honor guard, there was then a very large group of school children leaping for their lives worth with kind of pom-poms, and then a large dance group. So this is just for the guy to walk off the plane. Okay, this is the president of Kazakhstan. There in the image there, you can see how long that red carpet is and how there are people on both sides of the red carpet. And he's literally got like about 10 people walking with him. So he's one of the 5 Central Asian leaders who are gathering in the city of Xi'an. Now, we discussed this in part already. If we have time, I'll kind of like get back into the significance of the city. But this level of greeting, and I've sent this to a couple of other analysts, one in Russia and one in Asia, and they were like, this is like more than you'd expect for the king of Saudi Arabia. And this guy's just the president of Kazakhstan, right?
Yes.
So I saw the greetings for the guy from Tajikistan. I haven't seen Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan yet. Maybe they're coming in early tomorrow morning, Asia time, which will literally be like in a couple of hours, your time. But this is an indication of what's going to happen. Now, normally, these things are telegraphed very, very clearly. It's like a Federal Reserve or a European Central Bank decision. They very much manage expectations so that the markets aren't shocked. Okay, so they may not say we're going to raise by 35 basis points, but they'll say something like we shortly anticipate raising between 25 and 50 basis points. So it's like very much done in a narrow parameter. The Chinese are doing the reverse for this. They are specifically saying that a very important political document will be signed by all 6 presidents getting together for the first time in 32 years.
Wow.
Right? And they're not really letting on what it is. Now, we've got some indications that have leaked out of the other countries, and we've got a bizarre issue with relation to the media, which I'd like to discuss in detail because I think that's very significant. But the Chinese are very much saving this for Friday, which in and of itself, in the Chinese lunar calendar and with their astrology, the 19th of May, as it turns out, is a highly auspicious day for the signing of contracts, the laying of foundations for a house, starting a new business, moving home, all of these kind of things that might be metaphors for a new international treaty. So this date doesn't appear to have occurred simply because, it was half price golf on a Friday.
Yes. It's look, it's a big deal that we're watching that these nations here, and I put the screen up there to understand Kazakhstan and the STAN countries. It takes up a vast amount of land that joins China to Russia. And to understand and appreciate what's going on here. Simon, do we know anything else about what this deal could possibly cover?
Yeah, well, so we've got the minor issues, which are like cultural exchanges, university scholarships, transit visas, visa-free travel. Some of the countries 30 days, some of the countries 14 days, which is significant in itself because it's an indication of trust. We've had issues with Islamic terrorists, particularly going from Afghanistan into Uzbekistan, into the Uyghur population in Western China. So if you say, notwithstanding that we've had terrorist events in the last 10 years, particularly during the American involvement in Afghanistan, and that we're now going to allow people to move freely for up to a month, that is a significant change in the security arrangements on their borders. Now, their borders total 3,300 kilometers. That's 3 times the border between Finland and Russia. So it's a huge distance. Now, one other thing that has come out is supposedly there's agreement on the route for a third natural gas pipeline, a third one, separate from the Power of Siberia 1, Power of Siberia 2, to go through Kazakhstan. So once again, that is linking Russia to China, right? And it's a very, very long-term project. So when Putin warned all of Russian industry in March of last year, a few weeks after the initial invasion into Ukraine, that the shift to build infrastructure to get goods from Russia into the Far East, he specifically said it needs to be done super urgently. He actually said we need to start building tomorrow, right? That it needed to be decent quality, that we needed to find import substitutes so that if there was a particular box for the railway or a particular electronic valve for the pipeline, that could be made in China or in Russia, and that we weren't relying upon the Americans or the Germans to provide it. As we saw with the Nord Stream pipeline, they were having problem getting those things repaired in Canada. There was a big issue with having the annual maintenance being done on the turbines. So he anticipated that and said that we have to get away from those type of issues. But the most important thing that he warned all of Russian industry at a big meeting with hundreds of chairmen and CEO from all the biggest companies in Russia is he said this change is going to be permanent.
Yeah, right. Okay. It's massive, isn't it? Now, we're talking about pipelines and we're also talking about railway lines. And this is the other big side of all of this that we've been reporting for some time now in the Great Eurasian Partnership, which obviously incorporates China as the leader, but multiple Arab nations. And I want to put up this map that we've used many times on the show before, which explains that when you see in the middle there that Iran forms the hub in all of this, and the railway line in red stretches north into Russia and heads up towards Finland, where you've just reported on the size size of the border there between Russia and Finland, but then it transfers down through Iran and turns right on the screen towards India. And then if you look to the left of Iran, you see the Middle East. And this is why it's so interesting for those of us here in Australia that may not understand how all of these nations work together. But today there's been news of another signing of what may well be the last and final leg that incorporates all of this new railway network, this massive infrastructure build. And why it's so important, Simon, is because the United States have built virtually nothing in terms of infrastructure over the last quarter of a century, and yet China and Russia and the Middle East are developing infrastructure at a rate unseen ever before.
So if you would kindly go back to that map that you had there, I'll just explain the significance of this. So if you can see at the kind of bottom center of the screen, the one where all the lines go through, that is Iran. Okay. Now, the body of water that's immediately above Iran, that's the Caspian Sea. Okay. Now, the small country in yellow that borders the Caspian Sea on the left-hand side of the diagram, on the west side of the Caspian Sea, that is Azerbaijan. Now, they've been having a lot of friction with Iran recently, and that is the spoiler at the moment. And the Israelis are doing their utmost to really damage the previously reasonable relationship between Azerbaijan and Iran. Okay. Now, if you can imagine right from the very bottom of the small yellow patch, going down towards where the capital I of the name Iran is, okay, that is the remaining part of the railway network that is intended to go all the way from St. Petersburg right down to the new Iranian port of Chabahar. And there's a small 162 kilometer stretch of railway that goes from Astara, that straddles the Iranian Azeri border, to a big rail junction called Rasht, Rasht. Okay. And at the moment, that can go by rail all the way from Moscow or St. Petersburg to Astara. Then it had to be put onto a truck. Then it had to drive like 180 kilometers. Then it had to be put back onto a train. And then it would go to Bandar Abbas. Okay. But taking stuff one cargo unit at a time on and off trucks is very, very time consuming. So the idea is that you'll have a continuous rail path in addition to the route that's going to go China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and the route that's going to go China, Pakistan, Iran. These are huge spokes of a wheel with, bizarrely as it may seem, Iran being the hub. And, I know for all that people have watched Iran languish under sanctions for the last 43, 44 years, that it should suddenly become the center of global trade seems absolutely extraordinary. But this is happening this year. It's already underway. Now, it's not an ad hoc improvisation because of the Ukraine war. It was conceived in 2000. But because of all of the US sanctions on Iran, it's made it very, very difficult to get financing. Now, basically, between the growth of the Russian economy and particularly the growth of the Iranian economy, especially because of their enormous positive trade balance with the United States, the Chinese are just making, like $50 billion a month of profit off the Americans, right? They've now got money to spare. And that's why they're able to throw in 400 billion into Iran. Now that's going to be over 25 years, but it's still a massive amount, like 15 billion a year. And how they're able to afford to have thrown in 30 billion, and now, depending on whether or not the whole place disintegrates, potentially another 58 billion into Pakistan, right? But America is talking in comparison for putting 6.5 billion over 10 years spread between all of the nations of the South Pacific. It's like the Americans are putting up like tiny money in comparison.
Yes.
The Chinese are putting in like 10 or 100 times more, with less political strings attached and with no cultural conditions. They're not telling people they have to legalize abortion or legalize gay marriage.
This is such a big deal. First of all, it's not just the money side of it, it's also the conditions are part of it. So if you're just joining us, you've got a C5 meeting, which is the stand countries that are in between Russia and China, having a meeting with China this Friday. Massive fanfare with the president of Kazakhstan, the biggest country of all of the stands, that has arrived in China. The ceremony is quite extraordinary. And now we're talking about the links with the railways. And I just want to bring this up here, Simon, for that last link. And it's this one here, which we've got a clip here from Press TV on Twitter. US sanctions are finally working, just not in the way they were supposed to. Iran and Russia have signed a $1.6 billion deal for the construction of the Rasht-Astara Railway, which we've just been talking about. But it's really interesting here, Simon. On the screen, you can see the signatories going on. I'm going to flick through a few more pictures here. The construction, therefore, of this particular railway, and then more information. The project will connect the existing railways of the two countries and Azerbaijan, which you've just mentioned. And then the 162-kilometre railway will run from Rasht to Astara on the Azerbaijan border. And the last one here, it will be part of the international north-south transport corridor, possibly the largest investment we've seen in our lifetimes in terms of being able to link up all of these countries to supply goods in perpetuity from here. The project is aimed at integrating transport and information routes between Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran and India. And the final one here,
and that's the key. That's the key picture there.
Thank you. The agreement was signed by the Iranian transport minister and his Russian counterpart in Tehran. But look who's in the picture, who joined in on the right there, Putin, and down the bottom, Raisi there. Exactly. So you've got everyone involved here. It's massive, isn't it?
No. So when you look at the amount, 1.6 billion, in the overall scheme of things, that's not a great deal. But the reason why the two presidents were supervising the signing ceremony is because they recognize that it's literally the final piece of the puzzle going right into the center of the picture. Now, it's not an instant solution because it's going to take, I'm sure the Chinese could do it in a few months. The Iranians are saying it's going to take 3 years. It's not going to take that long. It's going to be done much faster because the political pressure on this is just astronomical. But their statement that it was ironic that it's US sanctions that have forced the completion of this project to come about is exactly true. If the US weren't making it very, very hard for Russia to ship its produce through the Suez Canal and the Baltic Sea and the Straits of Malacca and the Panama Canal and all these other kind of places, because of the insurance conditions that are being placed upon the Russian ships, they're not physically stopping them like pirates. If you go through the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal or the Bosphorus Straits, you have to have not only insurance on your ship in case it sinks and it has to be salvaged, but in the case of some products, in case it blows up and damages other infrastructure, or if it's full of oil, it leaks and does billions of dollars of damage to tourist beaches, right? And if you can't get that insurance, which at the moment is very difficult for Russian ships to obtain, you can't go through those choke points.
Yes.
And that's how the Americans are restricting Russian trade. So the Russians want to be able to do everything by ferry and rail through the center of the map, so to speak, rather than sailing around the outsides of the picture.
Wow. It's certainly, when you understand why and how this is all coming together and you realize the investment that's involved, it's not as if they need to fit in with America anymore. They literally can just work around them. And this is why it's so interesting, Simon, that you've been able to put this all together to explain the significance of the C5 meeting, the Arab League meeting, and the G7. What I'd like to do now is just duck into the G7, because we've introduced the idea of sanctions, and the G7 is looking likely that there are going to be some more discussions and implementations perhaps of new sanctions, and this is where the threat towards world war is very, very possible. What's happening with the G7 this Friday?
Do you want to do the Arab League first, or do you want to do the G7 first?
Well, the reason I jumped on G7 was I wanted to continue on the discussion of the sanctions. But if you think it's better to go through the Arab League and then come back, then we'll go that way.
If I may, we'll do the Arab League. We'll do the Arab League first. So, the Arab League is meeting on Friday. Now, it's very important for the audience to understand that that is the head of government day. So that's all the kings and presidents and in a few cases, prime ministers, right? Now, President Assad has been invited personally by the King of Saudi Arabia. It's extremely likely that he will attend in person. Now, what hasn't been described very well in the Western media, though we did mention, you and I, the previous meeting that took place last weekend in Cairo, which was the gathering of the foreign ministers. Okay. Now, they've been having side meetings of the social and welfare ministers, the economics ministers, the transportation ministers, today the foreign ministers again, right? And this is exceptional. The level of preparatory meeting occurring not a month or 2 months ahead, as has been occurring, say, with NATO and with the G7 and the G20. They've also been having side meetings before the big head of government meetings. And the reason why that is done is so that all the agreements can be signed on the same day by all of the presidents, and it's the presidents and the kings and queens who get the credit, not the bureaucrats who have been like checking all the translations and dotting all the T's and dotting the I's and stuff for the previous 3 or 4 months, right? But what we're seeing here now with the Arab League, because Syria has been readmitted or had its suspension cancelled, is that an great opportunity for huge strides forward has suddenly materialized. And so they're not kind of like tinkering around the periphery. They, in much the same way as is occurring in Xi'an in China with the C5, they are going to pull something massive, barring some incredible dispute at the last second, right? Between all the Arab nations. So we've got lots of potentials. So one thing that might potentially happen, though it would have to be carefully agreed in advance, is the president of Iran, which is not an Arab nation, it's a Persian nation, could suddenly materialize at the event, maybe not in the opening ceremony, but maybe halfway through, as an observer, which would be at the prerogative of the host nation. And the host nation is Saudi Arabia, and they're the ones who have just done the, for want of another word, peace deal with Iran in March, and they've already given them an invite, though not for this particular meeting. So imagine, and I'm not guaranteeing this is going to happen, but I'm just saying imagine for the audience, right? Syria has been readmitted to the Arab League. The Israelis are super annoyed about that, and the Americans are belatedly going bananas about that. So let's say in the morning, Assad turns up and 20 out of 22 people shake hands and they're all happy and friends together. Okay?
Yep.
Then at lunchtime, the freaking president of Iran shows up. Can you imagine the shock? Now, it'd only be an observer because not technically an Arab nation, right? But still would be like absolutely huge. And what could round that off would be the announcement of a peace deal, for want of another word, between Iran and Egypt that we learned just a few days ago, courtesy of a leak from a member of the Iranian parliament, who's probably now on a enforced diet somewhere, that has been secretly underway in Iraq, right? There's lots of things that could be done like surprise, none of which would be good news for the Americans or for the Israelis.
Yes.
Now, funnily enough, we had talked a few days ago about this other potential railway and shipping deal from India to Abu Dhabi and then across to via Riyadh to Amman and then from Amman to Haifa. Now, this frankly seemed politically overambitious, and it's interesting that some of the Indian press are now not so much second guessing it, but doubting whether or not it's politically palatable for the Saudis to do that kind of infrastructure benefit for the Israelis. And frankly, I can't see a good reason for it. Now, supposedly the Israelis want to transship stuff from Haifa to Piraeus. And the reason why the Indians were advocating for it to go through Haifa is the Indian company Adani, the one that almost went bust and its share price collapsed.
Yes.
They've bought a 70% interest in one of the wharves, one of the ship terminals at the port of Haifa. So it's hugely in their interest for the shipping to increase, because for every container they move, they get, $1,000, for example, right? So if that suddenly triples, then they'll get a really good return on their investment. But politically, if the railway is going ahead, as it appears to have been agreed, from Pakistan to China, Pakistan to Iran, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan to Iran, then into Syria, then into Jordan, Iraq, then Jordan, then Syria. There's 3 ports in Syria on the coastline where the Russians have a lot of interest, and those cargoes could be funneled not to one port in Israel, but to 3 ports in the Mediterranean coast of Syria, and potentially it would have an enormous economic benefit if some of the traffic were to be diverted to Acre and to Beirut in Lebanon. And channeling that trade through the devastated northwest corner of Syria and through Beirut could completely revitalize those countries. And so, from the point of view of Arab Brotherhood, if hypothetically, for a few moments, I were the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and I wanted to get out of my Lamborghini for a few seconds, then I would probably consider that route instead, if my overall goal was expanding the connectivity of my Muslim region and not risking conflict and falling out with countries like Oman or Iran or Iraq or Syria or Algeria by forcing all of this stuff through Israel. Israel basically could be really, really left out in the cold here.
Yes.
Now, the Americans, according to some reports out of the Lebanese media, as forecast, when we've discussed this previously, were not only unhappy, but tried to get the Saudis to back out of their Chinese-sponsored deal with Iran. Now, allegedly, according to these reports from two sources that I've read this week, they were told in no certain terms, drop the heck dead. Like, we're super happy with this deal. Everyone else is super happy about this deal. It's not just for us. It's going to be for like 6 or 7 other countries. And there's no way we are going to flip the bird to the president of China, who personally sponsored this agreement, and back out 2 months later. So they were told like completely out of the question. Okay. So then we had the foreign minister of Germany, Anna Baerbock, who is real skilled in pissing people off, having been extremely undiplomatic on her visit to China, really rubbing their face in the whole Taiwan situation. She then showed up for no apparent reason in Jeddah and started mouthing off about how Germany didn't think that the Arab League should readmit Syria without onerous conditions. And the point to note here is, one, that was too late. They had already done the deal. So once again, like the Americans, she was asking them to go back, not just one country like Saudi Arabia to go back, but 21 countries to go back on their word, right, which had occurred at the meeting in Cairo last Sunday. And then he appeared amazingly ignorant by suggesting that they had made a mistake by allowing Syria to re-enter unconditionally, when that wasn't the case. There was like 5 or 6 serious conditions. Now, there were questions as to how well Syria will comply with those conditions, but as far as the Arabs were concerned, as opposed to the Europeans, their biggest concern was to shut down the transit of illegal drugs through Syria that has basically been keeping the country afloat in the face of the bloody American and European sanctions.
Yes.
So the reason why Syria was having to become a narco state was because it basically was the only way they could feed themselves, because the Americans were stealing most of the oil, preventing food from being shipped in, and controlling like a quarter of their international borders. So, ironically, condition 6 of the 6 conditions for Syria to re-enter the Arab League was for all the other foreign powers to leave Syria.
Yes.
So that would include not just the Turks, who have already indicated a willingness to leave at some point, subject to some conditions regarding the Kurds, but would also force the Americans to leave, which is what President Trump told them to do years ago. And Milley and the Department of Defense tricked him and told him they had left, but in fact they hadn't.
Yes.
So, I mean, the hypocrisy of what is arguably America's top three vassal, along with Poland and I'm not sure who number three would be. It's hard to pick amongst the remaining. Certainly Britain. If we had to pick three European vassals, it would be Germany, Poland, and Britain.
Yes.
Okay? For them to be going to the Arab League, which is 22 independent nations, including one of the richest in the world, and say, back out of all these international agreements you've entered into. It's just like absolutely stunning hypocrisy. So that has done a really huge amount of damage, both to the American standing, which was already low, and now to the standing of the European Union, and in particular Germany. So moving on from the Arab League, where there's still, though it may not simply have had enough time yet to be announced, there are still two huge shoes to drop. So one is either the formation of a common currency, a commodity-backed currency, or simply the Gulf Cooperation Council breaking the fixed exchange rate with the American dollar.
Yes.
Any one of those three announcements would be seismic.
Yes.
Okay. So we've got those three potentials with regard to currency. The other one for which there is now significant indications, because I'm reading the press statements of a lot of bilateral meetings, and countries within the Arab League that do not have common borders, so say like Iraq and Egypt, or Tunisia and Saudi Arabia, or Algeria and Syria, they're like hundreds and hundreds of miles apart, don't have any common land crossings. Okay? But there are lots of mentions about economic integration. And I'm not just talking about transport connectivity, which has been discussed in relation to all these railway deals. That is physical, logistical infrastructure, right? I'm talking about free trade agreements and the kind of arrangement between the Arab states that would resemble, at a start, the original European Economic Community, the predecessor to the European Union, which involved monetary union and political union. So I'm not saying that all of them would instantly merge every aspect of all of their cultures, laws, and governments. I'm not saying that. But what could occur, and is definitely being talked about, is a economic merger, like the original European Economic Community. That started off just being coal and steel. Then it went to all physical trade. Then it went to like financial services. And then obviously, it went to more political and single currency union. So these kinds of things have stages. We could suddenly see the whole Arab League jump to stage 2, which was the EEC, because that's clearly what is being intended with the Greater Eurasian Partnership.
Yes.
So rather than every country in the Arab League joining that one by one, it might legally and economically make more sense for them to form their own bloc, run their own bloc, just like Europe, for 10 years, 5 or 10 or 20 years, iron out all the problems, and then for their Arab bloc to merge with the Greater Eurasian Partnership, which is like the Chinese and Russian bloc, and to do these things in stages. And if you remember, the guy who was appointed as the chief negotiator for the Gulf Cooperation Council, Dr. Al-Marouki, right? This is exactly what he is world famous for. Massive economic transformations and managing those so that the outcome goes smoothly. He is exactly the man that you would pick for this type of desired outcome.
Okay. Now, Simon, there's two more big stories here. One of them is the negotiations with South Africa and a peace agreement attempt with Ukraine and Russia. And, of course, the other is the possibilities out of the G7 meeting and the ideal of oil for food. This is where we want to go and link it all together. Where do you want to go next?
Let's deal very quickly with the South African thing then, because I'm aware of the time. So Zelensky, when he went to Rome, met with the Pope, and the Pope offered to try and mediate a peace deal, and he basically said that he didn't want the Vatican getting involved. That was reported out the Italian media. Okay, so the Pope's out. Then the Chinese appointed a special representative to Ukraine to try and mediate at least a ceasefire. Now, he went to Ukraine today, didn't meet with Zelensky, which was a bit of an insult, given that he's a special representative of the president of China. So one would have expected him to meet Zelensky. Met instead with the Ukrainian foreign minister, who told him two things. We don't want a ceasefire, which is the first thing the Chinese are trying to achieve, stop the killing. And also the first thing the Vatican was trying to achieve. And then secondly, he told the Chinese representative, who is a very, very senior diplomat, but they don't like, because previously he was the Chinese ambassador to Russia, so they think that he's pro-Russian. And they told him that they will not concede 1 square centimetre of Ukraine, including Crimea. So that's obviously like a complete non-starter.
Yes.
Okay. So it now remains to be seen whether this guy will even bother going to the French and the Germans, where he was scheduled to go to next to try and get their support for some kind of deal. But since the Ukrainians have basically told him, go away, drop dead, it's almost pointless going to these other European countries now. Now, the big issue is the Ukrainians and the Americans very belatedly have been touring around Africa trying to peel some of the African countries away from Russia and China. And obviously we've got this big conference coming up in St. Petersburg in July, that it would appear that all, if not almost all, of the 54 African countries are intending to attend. Okay. So today, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has announced that he has his own peace plan, and that he wanted to send a emissary, a special representative, to meet Zelensky and Putin in order to present the South African peace plan. Now, despite rejecting the Chinese and despite rejecting the Pope, Zelensky, because he's trying to win over members of the African Union, wasn't able to tell the South Africans to get stuffed. And so at some point soon, probably not until next week, the South Africans are going to send somebody to try and once again get some kind of peace deal in place. Now, that's how things remain. We've got to bear in mind that we've now got the BRICS head of government meeting coming up in August, but there's a lot to happen before then. So the final thing that we need to discuss, and we've got 10 minutes remaining, I'm aware, so we should be able to discuss this in detail, and please feel free to ask me any additional questions that you have, time allowing, is the meeting in Hiroshima of the G7. Now, once again, as the host government, the Prime Minister of Japan has exercised his prerogative to invite South Korea. And in addition to the G7 meeting, there's going to be a three-way meeting between America, South Korea, and Japan, who are essentially forming a defense agreement against China. Now, this is at the same time that NATO has announced that they're going to open their first Asian liaison office in Japan. Okay, so you've got the three-party anti-China group. You've got NATO, which is now identified as China as their greatest threat, along with Russia. Okay, now Biden was supposed to be going straight from those two meetings to meet in Papua New Guinea, and then announce his new South Pacific rollout, announcing more aid and a load of ambassadors and much greater engagement, having neglected the area for 30 years, literally since 1992. And now he's not going to Papua New Guinea. He was then going to go on and have a Quad meeting, which was Japan, Australia, America, and India in Australia. That's also now not happening because he has to desperately fly back to America and try and prevent America from going bust on the 1st of June, which is a distinct possibility at this point. So it now appears that Modi, and I think you verified this today at my request, that Albo are both going to fly to Japan, and they are going to meet up with Biden and the Japanese Prime Minister, and somehow they're going to try and jam 3 big meetings into 2.5 days.
Yes.
Okay. But the main agenda item of the G7 is to enforce sanctions on Russia. Okay. Now, this is critical, and this ties back in with the Arab League and also with the run-up to the Second Gulf War. So the sanctions that existed on Iraq in between the First and Second Gulf War. And many people will remember that we discussed about secondary sanctions, which the Chinese really hate. They really hate that. It irks them a lot. The South Africans are very against secondary sanctions. Brazil is very against secondary sanctions, right? So the proposal that's being put forward that may be vetoed by the French and or the Germans and or the Italians is that with regards to Russia, rather than everything being permissible to sell to the Russians except a defined list of sanctioned goods, instead they would copy the 1990s Iraq oil for food program, and everything would be banned for export to Russia except a list of specific permitted items that could be paid for by the Russians selling a list of specifically permitted exports. So this is very similar to what the Americans have done on Cuba and identical to what they did on Iraq, and similar in some regards to what they've done in the past with Iran. Okay? Mm-hmm. But you're now talking not with those small countries that were relatively easy to isolate, albeit that there was lots of cross-border smuggling. But you're now talking about imposing the equivalent of the Iraqi oil for food program on the Russian Federation, all 11 time zones of it. Mm-hmm. Okay. There is no way China is going to cooperate with that. Okay. Now, the double threat that the Americans appear to be suggesting is that any country who sells anything that is not on the specific list of approved goods would themselves be sanctioned. So yes. What they're saying is, we, America, and our allies in NATO will not only sanction Russia, but will sanction China and Saudi Arabia and Brazil and Argentina and every country in Africa from pretty much doing any trade with Russia. And you have to remember that economic sanctions and blockades are forms of warfare. Yes. In the context of fifth generation or hybrid warfare or total warfare, blockades and sanctions are a leg of the combination of resources that you use against that nation.
Yes, economic warfare.
So the Chinese, when they went to Norway, Mr. Qin Gang, the foreign minister, he explained that we don't want you to de-risk, we don't want you to decouple, and we don't want a second Cold War to exist against China. And we want to have progressive free trade agreements with the European Union. If this proposal were approved, it would crush all three of those aspirations. And already, in terms of there existing a second Cold War between China and America, whilst trade still exists, we now have had Henry Kissinger, Professor Niall Ferguson, and Professor Mearsheimer all saying that as of several months ago, a new second Cold War exists between America and China. And it's just a question of whether or not the European Union can be forced to join in with that, which would be economically suicidal for them, and would then cremate themselves having committed suicide with the Americans by imposing secondary sanctions on the rest of the world, literally. And that is the issue that they're going to be debating on Friday and Saturday in Japan.
That's just remarkable, isn't it? Richard has commented the US is going to sanction itself into an ostracised third world country that no one will deal with. It seems, Simon, that the pieces of the puzzle are all being put together with the combination of the C5, the Arab League and the G7 meetings. Truly extraordinary set of circumstances. Now, just quickly, Simon, you'll be appearing on TNT Radio on Saturday morning Australian time to talk more about the results of each of these three meetings on Havoye Morich's show. That's 10 a.m. Brisbane time. I believe that's 8 p.m. your time in Florida for those people. TNTradio.live to get the most about the latest in those details there. And we will regroup with Simon again for more details and possibly a special broadcast over the weekend, Simon.
Yeah, you and I will probably speak at the latest on my Sunday night, your Monday morning.
Yes, that will be the absolute latest, and it's highly likely that we may go out earlier than that, just to time permitting over the weekend. But we're determined to bring all the latest details. Just want to thank everyone for sticking with and sharing these broadcasts. And I know that it's quite difficult to understand, but when you start to get the gist and the feel, you'll appreciate the unbelievable work that Simon is doing in interpreting the information and digging deeper. I mean, just before in our pre-pro, Simon was telling me that he's actually translating Kazakhstan news. Can you believe that? That's the level of detail that we do here to get to the facts of the matter. And why do we do it? Because the mainstream news has dropped the ball, and we're also living in an age of propaganda where the West is fighting against the rest. And could you imagine that the US could be that stupid to sanction itself into oblivion, trying to create a situation where you're either for us or against us? And by the way that the the way that the rest of the world is de-dollarizing, it's pretty obvious that they're happy to go against a very weak US under the Biden regime. Goodness me, we've hit the hour already, Simon. I just want to say thanks again. Good luck on the show on TNT Radio with Havoya. Should be really interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing it, and we'll regroup again as we always do. And please check out Simon on Twitter. It's Simon from Florida. I'm just going to put that up right now on the screen for those people that want to check Simon's details. Really, really interesting. Simon from Florida too. You can check mine out at Jason Q Citizen 1 there as well. We broadcast these videos live on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, and you can also check it out on Rumble as well. And it's another way, if we ever get taken down, that you'll be able to get copies of this information for everyone to share. Thank you, everyone. We'll cut it off there, and we'll see you all on the next show.